My name is Lydia Hawthorne. I am 32 years old, and for exactly 24 years, I believed my mother was a saint who sacrificed everything for our family. But last November, in the humid entryway of our coastal home, my father changed his phone number to lock me out, triggering an irreversible chain reaction that changed everything. How did a simple inheritance dispute expose a lifetime of lies? A secret trust fund, my mother's forged signatures on certified mail, and a hidden audio recording of my uncle's final warning. Within just 72 hours, our entire family empire collapsed into absolute ruin. At the center of it all was my mother, who sat quietly adjusting her gold leaf pin, completely oblivious that her long deception was finally over. Before I do, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story earns it. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I like knowing who's out there. My name is Lydia Hawthorne. I am 32 years old. Last November, I finally stood in the entryway of my parents' coastal home on Tybee Island and told them I was going entirely, permanently silent. My mother looked me dead in the eyes, let out a sharp, mocking laugh, and said, "Good luck. You'll be crawling back begging by Christmas, just like the ungrateful, dramatic daughter you've always been." My father stood beside her, his face twisted in a cold sneer. "We've put up with your fabrications for 20 years, Lydia," he said, his voice flat and unyielding. "Don't expect a single call from us." The very next morning, he changed his personal phone number, contacted the board of our family's wellness foundation, and quietly let it be known to the entire community that I was dead to them. 6 months later, a thick, certified envelope arrived at my door in Atlanta. It was a formal demand to return every single proprietary formula and historic apothecary journal I had allegedly stolen from my late uncle within 21 days, or they would sue me. They believed they had buried the truth along with him in the coastal Georgia clay. What they didn't know was that my uncle had left behind something far more dangerous than old leather-bound notebooks. And by the time their corporate lawyer read his final words aloud in that wood-paneled room, my mother's pristine, public-facing smile completely shattered. If you have ever been labeled the difficult one by the very people who were supposed to protect you, you know the quiet weight of that isolation. If you know exactly how it feels to watch a family construct a lie so perfect that even you begin to doubt your own memory, then you know that the truth doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it waits. And the truth they tried to bury is about to bury them instead. I was 13 the first time an adult told me to be quiet about my mother. His name was Chairman Christopher Palmer. He was the head of the local Historical Preservation Society and a close associate of my parents' Wellness Foundation. I had walked the dusty, sun-baked blocks to his historic home after an afternoon community meeting because I simply didn't know where else to go. His deep southern porch had 2 white wicker rocking chairs and a clay pot of blue hydrangeas that looked wilted in the heavy afternoon heat. He opened the door before I could even raise my hand to knock, as if he had been watching me from the hallway. He didn't ask why I was there, he simply pointed me toward the kitchen. He poured me warm herbal tea in a heavy ceramic mug with a single fern leaf pressed into the glaze. I was 13. I had never been served tea in an adult's kitchen like an equal. I tried to tell him that my mother spoke to me differently when the heavy oak doors of our house were closed and the guests had gone. I didn't have the precise vocabulary for emotional cruelty yet, I didn't know how to explain the sudden, freezing shifts in her temperament. I just told him she became a different woman when the company left. He listened with his large, sun-spotted hands folded neatly on the table. He said nothing for a long time, the ice in his own glass melting silently. Then, he looked at me with a soft, patronizing pity and told me to honor my mother. He said some families are given heavier crosses to bear, and that my mother's public work for the community required immense sacrifice. I counted the tiny green circles painted around the rim of my mug because I couldn't bear to look at the gentle dismissal in his eyes. There were exactly 42 of them. I have counted 42 things in waiting rooms, offices, and hallways ever since. Before I left his house, he picked up the landline phone. I never found out who he called that afternoon, but the next week, my mother, Deborah Hawthorne, volunteered to run the foundation's youth outreach program. Everyone in our coastal town called it a beautiful, selfless calling. I knew it was a leash. That was when the label truly began to take shape. It didn't arrive all at once, it settled over me in thin, freezing layers, the way frost forms on a windowpane. By the time I was 15, I was the difficult child. By the time I was 20, I was the dramatic one. By the time I was 25, I was the daughter my family apologized for in advance to prospective business partners and neighbors. There are 100 small, deliberate cuts I could describe to you, but I will give you just 3. When I turned 10, my mother decided I would not be allowed to attend my own birthday celebration, a private garden luncheon at our family's flagship apothecary boutique, because she claimed I had made a scene by refusing to wear a specific dress earlier that morning. She didn't tell me directly. She simply told the other children and their parents that I was feeling unwell. They returned to the house hours later with small, wrapped boxes of organic lavender soaps and leftover pastries, placing them on the kitchen counter like a peace offering for a conflict I hadn't even been permitted to participate in. Years later, when my cousin Brandon got married, I was asked to be a bridesmaid. 3 weeks before the ceremony, the designer's studio called to inform me that my measurements had been completely removed from the order. My mother told me over Sunday dinner, with a delicate sigh, that the structured linen of the bridal party gown simply wouldn't have suited my frame. I am 5 feet 7 inches tall, and I have never had an unusual shape. I simply had a habit of wanting to stand up straight. But the earliest, quietest cut happened when my grandfather, Charles Langston, died. I was 8 years old. No one called me to the living room to tell me. No one held my hand. I read about his passing in the local morning paper left on the breakfast table. The newsprint had been folded precisely so that the obituary faced my chair when I sat down for my morning toast. When I began to cry, my mother looked up from her planner and remarked that I was being entirely too dramatic for a child who had only met the man a handful of times. But there was a name in that obituary that would change everything for me, Arthur Langston. My mother's younger brother. My uncle. Arthur lived in a quiet, salt-bleached cottage in Savannah, about an hour's drive from our home. He was a quiet, meticulous man who worked as a reference librarian and spent his spare hours documenting the native flora of the Georgia marshes. He lived alone, he never married, and he drove a faded gray sedan that always smelled faintly of dried eucalyptus and old paper. He was the only adult in my family who ever truly looked at me and saw a person rather than a project. Every year on my birthday, he would call my personal phone directly, bypassing my mother's strict gatekeeping. He sent me books that my mother deemed far too complex or worldly for a girl of my age. When I turned 16, he mailed me a worn, leather-bound volume of classic essays on nature and self-reliance. Inside the front cover, in his precise, looping handwriting, he had written, "The woods do not ask for permission to grow, and neither should you." I kept that book hidden in the bottom drawer of my desk, tucked beneath my school papers. It sat in the same dark space where, years later, I would place a small wooden box I was too afraid to open. My mother always found out about his calls, of course. She would sit me down afterward, her voice dripping with a soft, manufactured concern, and explain that Uncle Arthur wasn't entirely well. She whispered that he had always been fragile, that he had never quite managed to integrate into the family business because he lacked the necessary strength of character. But Arthur had plenty of strength, he simply refused to use it to build her empire. The label didn't stay inside the walls of our Tybee Island home. It walked. It went to spring garden tours, to historical preservation luncheons, and to the annual Savannah Heritage Festival in the spring of 2014. I was 24 years old, a newly minted doctor of pharmacy, and I had just accepted a demanding residency at a major hospital in Atlanta. My mother, however, had decided that my professional achievements were secondary to the public image of Hawthorne Wellness. She demanded that I spend my only free weekend staffing the company's promotional booth, handing out samples of organic hibiscus teas and lavender salves under a sweltering canvas tent. When I told her I couldn't make the drive because of a consecutive sequence of 36-hour on-call shifts, the machinery of her disapproval began to grind. Within 15 minutes of my phone call, she was standing by the lemonade stand at the festival, surrounded by the prominent women of the local historical society. I know this because a sympathetic family friend told me later. My mother had sighed, adjusted her linen shawl, and whispered, "Lydia tells us she is too busy with her hospital work to help her own family. We don't ask her for much, ladies. Please keep us in your thoughts." I drove 90 miles back to Atlanta that night after my shift ended, the humid Georgia air heavy through the open windows of my car. The taste of dust and salt was on my lips, and the realization that my achievements would always be framed as acts of defiance was beginning to harden inside me. For 3 years after that festival, my mother used her position as the director of the Hawthorne Foundation's charitable newsletter to run a quiet, highly effective campaign of character assassination. The newsletter was sent monthly to over 300 local families, donors, and business associates. Tucked neatly beneath the updates on community grants and botanical preservation projects was always a small, vague paragraph about our family. "Please keep our dear Lydia in your thoughts," she would write. "She is navigating another of her difficult, solitary seasons. Preston and I are holding on to hope, trusting that she will find her way back to the peace of the family circle." There were never any specific incidents mentioned, no concrete accusations. Just a continuous, gentle dripping of concern that painted me as fragile, unstable, and perpetually lost. I saved every single one of those digital newsletters in a hidden folder on my computer. I titled it, "The Narrative." By the time I finally stopped looking, there were 62 entries. I never replied to a single one. The community did the work for her. The replies to the newsletter, which my mother occasionally forwarded to me, by accident, were a chorus of polite pity. "Thinking of you, Deborah. You are such a steadfast mother. We are holding Lydia in our hearts." I did not need to be present for my own social ruin, she had automated it. The peak of this manipulation occurred during my cousin Brandon's engagement dinner in the summer of 2017. The event was held in a beautifully restored historic pavilion overlooking the salt marshes. I had volunteered to coordinate the arrival of the external catering staff. When a sudden highway accident delayed the delivery truck and I had to leave early to prepare for a critical clinical pharmacy seminar in Atlanta, my mother took the microphone to announce that I had departed abruptly because I struggled to witness other people's joy. By the time the gossip traveled from Savannah to Atlanta, the story had mutated into a wild fabrication. People whispered that I had thrown a silver platter of oysters at the caterers and screamed at the bride-to-be. I had done nothing of the sort. I had driven 93 miles through a blinding summer thunderstorm to present a research paper I had spent 6 months writing. But Brandon believed the theatrical version. Years later, when I bumped into him in the organic produce aisle of a Savannah grocery store, he approached me with a cautious, hesitant step, as if he were trying not to startle a wild animal. "No hard feelings about the engagement dinner, Lydia," he said softly, keeping his distance. "Aunt Deborah told us you were going through a very dark period back then." I looked at him, at the genuine, misplaced pity in his eyes, and I realized the futility of explaining. I quietly placed my basket of groceries on an empty shelf and walked out of the store. I did not call him back. The true turning point came in June of 2018. Uncle Arthur was 55 years old when he received the diagnosis, stage 3 pancreatic cancer. He called me from his gray sedan in the parking lot of Memorial University Medical Center in Savannah, his voice remarkably steady despite the devastating news. He made me swear a solemn promise. "Lydia, do not tell your mother yet," he whispered, the sound of the coastal wind rustling through his open window. "I want to gather my thoughts and call her myself when I am ready." But Arthur underestimated the reach of the Foundation's networks. 2 days later, before he had even been discharged from the outpatient clinic, my mother sent a special bulletin to the entire Foundation mailing list. "Our beloved Arthur is facing a profound physical trial," the email read. "Please keep the Langston family in your prayers during this season of unimaginable grief." I called Arthur that night, my chest tight with anger. I didn't even have to explain why I was calling. "She always gets there first, Lydia," he said, his voice tired but strangely calm. Even at her own brother's tragedy, she must be the one to hold the microphone. And then, he said something that would take me years to fully understand. The next time you come down to Savannah, I want you to meet someone. His name is Pete Wyatt. He's a retired paramedic and a brilliant botanist. He's helping me organize my personal papers and my old journals. If anything happens to me, remember his name. I drove down to Tybee Island on the 16th of November, last year. I hadn't decided to go silent when I started the engine of my car in Atlanta. I was simply going to a family dinner. But in my glove compartment, I had a small manila envelope containing a list of 12 specific public lies my mother had circulated about my professional standing over the past year, including a rumor that I had been suspended from the hospital, when in reality I had just been promoted. I touched the envelope at every red light along the coastal highway, a silent talisman of my own reality. My brother Silas's truck was already parked in the driveway when I arrived. He rarely visited on weekends, and the atmosphere inside the house was suffocatingly tense. The dining table was set with the heavy family silver, and the scent of roasted pecan wild rice filled the air. The rice was slightly scorched at the edges, with a single burnt sprig of rosemary resting in the center like a dark, deliberate mark. Before we had even finished pouring the water, Silas made an announcement. His second marriage was ending, and he was facing a massive financial restructuring that would force him to sell his share of the Savannah property. My mother set her water glass down with agonizing slowness, her eyes tracking the condensation on the crystal. Then, she looked across the table at me, her face softening into that familiar, professional mask of maternal concern. "Lydia, sweetheart," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. "Perhaps Silas could stay in your Atlanta apartment while you work your night shifts. It's mostly empty during those hours anyway, and this is what family does." "What family does is ask," I replied quietly, keeping my hands flat on the table. "What you do is announce." It was my father, Preston, who broke the silence. For 20 years, he had sat quietly at the end of the table, letting my mother direct the family theater. But tonight, his face flushed a deep, angry red. He folded his linen napkin into precise quarters and slammed it onto the table. "We have put up with your selfishness and your fabrications for 20 years, Lydia," he spat, his voice shaking with a cold, long-repressed fury. "Do not sit at this table and lecture us about family." I stood up slowly. I did not raise my voice. I did not look at the scorched rice or the heavy silver. "I came here to tell you something, but I am going to say it now," I said. "I am leaving for Atlanta tonight. And you are not going to hear from me again. Not on holidays, not on birthdays, not at funerals. Do not call me. Do not send people to find me." My mother did not cry. She did not look angry. She simply folded her own napkin, matching my father's precise quarters, and looked up with a rested, victorious expression. She had been waiting for this scene. She laughed once, a low, dismissive sound in her throat. "Good luck," she said. "You'll be crawling back begging by Christmas, just like the ungrateful, dramatic daughter you've always been." My father sneered. "Don't expect a single call from us, Lydia. Not one." Silas followed me out to the porch, grabbing my wrist in the humid night air. "Lydia, please don't make this about me," he whispered, his eyes darting back toward the house. I pulled my arm away without looking at him. As I waited for my car in the driveway, I heard my father inside, his voice carrying through the open window as he called the Foundation's administrative secretary. "Remove Lydia's name from all family communications and Foundation records immediately," he said, his voice cracking slightly before hardening. "She is no longer a part of this family." The next morning, he changed his phone number. The day after that, my mother posted a public statement on the Foundation's website: "The hardest decisions often require the greatest strength. Sometimes, love means letting go of those who refuse to honor their family. We are moving forward in peace." The post received dozens of supportive comments from the community within hours. I drove back to Atlanta in the dark, the silence in my car absolute. I did not cry. I put the manila envelope in the bottom drawer of my dresser, right next to the small wooden box Uncle Arthur had given me before he died. I texted my best friend, Miranda, "It's done." Her reply came instantly, "I'm here. Sleep now." I worked Christmas Day at the hospital in Atlanta. I had volunteered for the shift back in October, long before the final dinner on Tybee Island, because the inpatient pharmacy always needed holiday coverage and because I knew there would be no empty chair waiting for me at home. I held my morning coffee cup tightly in the sterile, fluorescent light of the basement pharmacy, watching the digital clock on the wall. For the first time in 32 years, my mother did not send a text message at exactly noon on Christmas Day. My colleague, Hannah Owens, a quiet pharmacist who knew only that I didn't go home for the holidays, slid a small tin of homemade shortbread across the stainless steel counter without a word. "I don't know the whole story, and I won't ask," Hannah said gently, adjusting her lab coat. "But nobody should eat holiday leftovers alone. We've got a long shift ahead, Lydia." Later that afternoon, a retired schoolteacher named Eleanor came to the outpatient window to pick up her husband's specialized cardiac medication. She wore a hand-knitted scarf the color of mustard and had a tired, beautiful patience in her eyes. As I handed her the vials, she reached through the opening, touched the back of my hand, and thanked me for being there on a holiday. I had to step into the sterile compounding clean room for a few minutes after she left. I drank water from a paper cup, stared at the stainless steel prep tables, and forced my breathing to slow down. Then I went back to work. When I opened my staff locker at the end of my shift, I found a holiday card that had been slipped through the mail slot. It wasn't from anyone at the hospital. The envelope was postmarked from Savannah, addressed in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. It was from Pete Wyatt, the retired paramedic and botanist who had cared for Uncle Arthur during his final months in 2020. I hadn't heard from him in nearly 6 years. The card featured a simple sketch of a wild Georgia sea oat on the front. Inside, Pete had written 4 lines. "Lydia, I was sorting through some of Arthur's old botanical field notes last week and thought of you. There is something about his final days that I never fully explained. Call me when you have a quiet moment. Pete." I slipped the card into my coat pocket. I did not call him that night. I drove back to my small apartment, crawled under the heavy quilt on my bed, and slept for 12 hours without dreaming. The months that followed were quiet, structured, and entirely devoid of family. I picked up extra night shifts at the pharmacy, using the repetitive task of verifying dosages and compounding IVs to keep my mind anchored. My best friend, Miranda Clark, made me come to her apartment for dinner on Valentine's Day so I wouldn't sit alone with my thoughts. She made a simple pasta dish, we watched old black and white films, and she let me sleep on her sofa under the same faded throw blanket we had shared during our university days. In the morning, she handed me a mug of black coffee and talked loudly about her terrible landlord, giving me the space to be silent about my own life. I started running again, tracing the wooded paths along the Chattahoochee River on Saturday mornings. I bought a paper planner with a plain black cover because my therapist had suggested that physically writing down my days might help me feel more grounded. In the margins of the days when I felt the urge to check the Foundation's public website or search for my mother's name, I wrote a single phrase: "Keep moving forward." By March, I stopped writing it. Not because the grief had vanished, but because I was beginning to trust the quiet life I was building. But the family narrative was still moving, even if I had stepped out of its path. My cousin Brandon sent me a text message in late February. "Lydia, Aunt Deborah is telling everyone in Savannah that you took Uncle Arthur's private apothecary journals and his original wellness formulas from the family archives. I don't believe her, but she's making a massive issue of it with the Foundation board. Just wanted to give you a heads up." I stared at the screen for a long time before typing a single sentence in response: "Thank you for telling me, Brandon. I am okay." I did not delete his number, but I muted the conversation. 2 weeks later, a distant aunt on my father's side called my personal line. Her voice was strained, thick with the polite, artificial sweetness of coastal society. She asked if I would consider returning grandfather Charles's historic botanical journals to the family collection where they belong. I didn't even possess the journals she was referring to. They had been left in Uncle Arthur's cottage, which my parents had cleared out years ago. A trap was being constructed, piece by piece, and I could see the outline of it in the dark. I finally called Pete Wyatt on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in late March. We spoke for nearly an hour. His voice was warm, carrying the slow, melodic drawl of the Georgia coast. "Lydia, I sat on this information for years because I didn't want to cause a rift before you were ready," Pete said, his tone turning serious. "But your uncle was the most meticulous man I ever cared for. He knew exactly what your mother would do once he was gone. He gave me a specific instruction. He said, if Deborah ever tries to claim my research or my papers, you tell Lydia to call Alastair Sterling. The codicil is real." That evening, Pete emailed me a photograph. It was a high-resolution image of a single sheet of yellow legal paper, written in Uncle Arthur's precise, looping script. It was a detailed inventory of the items he had personally gifted to me before his death. I stared at his handwriting on my computer screen for 15 minutes, my chest aching with a mixture of grief and gratitude. I did not call Alastair Sterling yet. I didn't think I would need to. I simply saved the image to a secure folder and went to bed. The certified letter arrived on the 12th of May, exactly 6 months and 3 weeks after I had walked out of my parents' home. It was a humid Tuesday morning. I was in my kitchen, still in my pajamas, waiting for my coffee to brew, when the doorbell rang. The postal carrier stood on the porch, holding a thick, white envelope that required a physical signature. The return address in the upper left corner was printed in a sharp, elegant font, Vance and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Savannah, Georgia. A bright red stamp on the front read, "Urgent, response required within 21 days." I signed the digital pad, closed the door, and sat down at my kitchen table. My hands were perfectly steady as I slid a butter knife under the seal of the envelope. The letter was signed by Rupert Vance, the chief corporate counsel for my parents' wellness empire. It formally identified Preston and Deborah Hawthorne as his clients. It demanded, under threat of immediate civil litigation, the return of all proprietary organic formulas, historic apothecary journals, and botanical research papers unlawfully removed from the estate of Arthur Langston. The letter listed 12 specific items, including Uncle Arthur's personal leather-bound journals from his years in the salt marshes, and several hand-formulated recipes for the natural remedies that had formed the foundation of my parents' luxury retail line. The word theft appeared 3 times. But it was the paragraph at the bottom of the second page that made me let out a short, cold laugh. Should you fail to comply within the designated 21-day period, our clients intend to pursue full legal remedies, including civil action for conversion, intellectual property theft, corporate espionage, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress upon the surviving family. Damages sought will not be less than $175,000, in addition to all associated legal fees. My parents, who had erased my name from their lives, who had told the entire community I was dead to them, were threatening to sue me for $175,000 for stealing the very journals my uncle had given me to protect. I picked up my phone, scrolled past my mother's blocked number, and dialed the office of Alastair Sterling, the Savannah estate attorney Uncle Arthur had trusted. He answered on the second ring, as if he had been waiting for my call. "Lydia," Alastair said, his voice deep and reassuringly calm. "I've been waiting for this envelope to land on your desk. Rupert Vance is a capable corporate lawyer, but he has been given incredibly poor information by your parents. Can you drive down to Savannah this Friday? Before we do anything, you need to see the original codicil. And Lydia, open the wooden box Arthur gave you. He wanted you to read at least the first few letters before we met. Bring everything." I hung up the phone with Alastair Sterling and sat in the quiet of my Atlanta kitchen. The cold coffee in my mug sat undisturbed. I walked slowly to my bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, and lifted out the small cedar box Uncle Arthur had given me. It was heavier than it looked, the wood smooth and smelling faintly of dried lavender and salt. I sat on the floor with the box on my lap for a long time before I finally lifted the lid. Inside, there was a neat stack of 17 envelopes, each the color of unbleached paper. They were numbered in pencil at the top right corner, from 1 to 17, in my uncle's precise, looping hand. Beneath the stack lay an 18th envelope, thicker than the rest, sealed with a dollop of dark red wax. The wax had a hairline crack running through the center, where it had settled over time. On the front, written in the same steady hand, were 7 words, "For Deborah, only if she asks why." Beside the envelopes lay a small black flash drive with a handwritten label, "Pete's recording for the attorney, if needed." I took out the first envelope and slid the letter from its casing. "Dear Lydia," it began. "By the time you read this, I will probably be gone. I am writing these letters because there are truths I owe you, and time I can no longer give you. Please read them in order. I am not always strong in these pages. There are parts where my anger gets the better of me. Forgive me for that." I read the first 3 letters sitting on the floor, my back pressed against the side of my bed. They were filled with quiet memories of the marshes, of the books we had shared, and of his quiet encouragement. But when I reached the 4th envelope, my hands began to tremble slightly. I knew, instinctively, that this was where the wind would turn. Letter 4 was dated February 23, 2020, just 4 months before Uncle Arthur passed away. The ink was slightly lighter, the pen strokes shaking on the longer vowels, but the message was razor-sharp. He wrote about his own childhood in the shadow of our family's growing wellness empire. He wrote about his father, grandfather Charles Langston, and the cold, systematic way my mother, Deborah, had isolated him once she took control of the family foundation. "Deborah treats you the way she treated our father," Arthur wrote. "She hates that you have his face, the face she spent her entire life trying to erase from her memory. I am deeply sorry I never spoke up when you were younger, Lydia. I was afraid of her, and I let my fear keep me quiet. Speak up for yourself now, when I no longer can. You are not the difficult one, Lydia. You are simply the only one of us who refused to repeat the silence." I stood up slowly, leaving the letter on the bed, and walked into the bathroom. I turned on the overhead light and looked at my reflection in the mirror. For 32 years, I had been told by my mother that I had her features, that I was her physical legacy. It had always felt like a description written in a language I couldn't speak. But as I stared at my eyes, the high bridge of my nose, and the sharp line of my jaw, I didn't see Deborah Hawthorne. I saw the face of grandfather Charles Langston from the few old black and white photographs I had managed to save. I had inherited his face, the face of the man who had founded the original apothecary before my mother rebranded it into a commercial luxury empire. I was the living reminder of the legacy she had stolen and rewritten. I did not cry. A cold, quiet clarity settled over me. I packed the letters back into the cedar box, placed the flash drive in my pocket, and prepared for the drive to Savannah. On Friday morning, the 15th of May, I drove 80 miles down the coastal highway. The marsh grass was a brilliant, pale green under the heavy spring sky. Alastair Sterling's office was located in a restored brick row house in the historic heart of Savannah, its windows overlooking a square shaded by ancient live oaks dripping with Spanish moss. Alastair opened the door himself. He was a man in his late 60s, with a neat crown of white hair and half-glasses resting on a silver chain around his neck. He led me into a quiet office lined with leather-bound books and gestured for me to sit. On his desk lay a thick, blue folder labeled Langston, A. Estate file. "Thank you for coming, Lydia," Alastair said, his voice carrying the slow, reassuring weight of an experienced Southern attorney. "Your uncle came into this office on the 4th of November, 2019. He was incredibly ill, but his mind was as sharp as it had ever been. We spent 6 hours drafting the codicil to his will. He was very specific about how this needed to be handled." He opened the folder and slid a document across the desk. It was 3 pages long, bearing Uncle Arthur's signature and a blue notary seal dated November 11, 2019. "Arthur knew your mother would try to intercept his estate," Alastair explained, leaning back in his chair. Because of that, he instructed me to send all formal probate notices to the only physical address he had on file for you at the time, your parents' home on Tybee Island. I sent 3 separate certified notices over the years, in 2020, 2022, and 2024. Each one was returned to my office with a signed delivery receipt. He turned the page, revealing 3 photocopied receipts. The signatures on the lines were unmistakable. Your mother signed for them, Alastair said quietly. She and your father knew about the trust. Under state law, unclaimed estate funds remain in a holding trust for 7 years before reverting to the state. We are currently in year 5. The $89,000 Arthur left to you has been sitting in an account, waiting for you to claim it. Your parents never told you because they wanted the clock to run out. I stared at my mother's elegant, cursive signature on the receipts. The deception was complete, calculated, and entirely legal in its execution until now. That's not all, Alastair continued. Your parents have attempted to challenge this codicil in court on 3 separate occasions. Once in 2020, claiming Arthur lacked the mental capacity to sign. Once in 2021, alleging undue influence. And once in 2023, on a minor procedural defect. They lost all 3 times. I have the court dismissals right here. They kept those lawsuits entirely quiet because they didn't want you to find out the trust existed. He slid a smaller folder toward me, then placed the sealed red wax envelope on top of it. This was Arthur's final instruction, Alastair said, his eyes meeting mine. He told me, if Deborah ever sends a lawyer after Lydia, this envelope goes on the table. If she asks why, Lydia is to read it aloud. If she doesn't ask, Lydia takes it home unopened. He knew exactly how her mind worked. My parents had sent a corporate lawyer to threaten me with a $175,000 lawsuit for corporate espionage and theft of family heirlooms. They believed I was a vulnerable night shift pharmacy technician who would break under the threat of financial ruin. They thought I had stolen old journals. What I actually had was a legally binding, court-tested codicil, 17 letters documenting decades of family manipulation, a recorded statement from Arthur's hospice nurse, and a sealed confession waiting for the perfect moment. I drove back to Atlanta that afternoon with the sealed envelope resting on the passenger seat. The weight of the past 30 years felt lighter, replaced by the cold, analytical precision of my training. I was a doctor of pharmacy. I spent my nights analyzing complex chemical structures and verifying critical dosages. I knew how to look at a chaotic system and find the single point of failure. Over the weekend, I purchased a heavy black binder and several dividers. I spent hours organizing my counteroffensive into 6 distinct tabs. Tab 1 held the certified copies of the codicil and the court dismissals. Tab 2 held the 17 letters from Uncle Arthur, arranged in chronological order. Tab 3 held the printed transcript of Pete Wyatt's recorded statement, which Alastair had prepared for me. Tab 4 held a printed selection of the 62 Foundation newsletters my mother had used to smear my character over the years. Tab 5 held a digital audio file I had transferred to a secure drive, a voicemail my mother had left on my phone on Christmas Eve of 2019, which I had never deleted. Tab 6 held a precise, handwritten timeline of every family event, every public accusation, and every legal action my parents had taken against me from 2003 to the present day. I left tab 7 entirely empty. That was where the sealed red wax envelope would go, but only if my mother asked the question. I called Miranda and Hannah that evening. I didn't ask them to help me fight, I simply asked them to stand with me. Hannah didn't hesitate for a second. "I'll take the day off," she said over the phone. "You've spent years quietly keeping everyone else safe in that pharmacy, Lydia. It's time someone stood in your corner." On Sunday evening, Alastair emailed me the final confirmation. My parents' corporate attorney, Rupert Vance, had agreed to a formal meeting at Alastair's office in Savannah on the following Tuesday morning. "They're coming," Alastair wrote. "All of them. Your mother, your father, and Silas. They think they are coming to sign a settlement agreement. They have no idea what is waiting for them. The night before the meeting, I did not sleep. I drove down from Atlanta in the quiet hours before dawn, watching the headlights of my car cut through the dense, low-hanging fog that rolled off the salt marshes. The air grew progressively heavier, thick with the scent of pluff mud, decaying oak leaves, and the sharp tang of tidal salt. By the time I parked near the historic square in Savannah, the sun was a pale, watery disk rising behind a curtain of Spanish moss. I met Miranda and Hannah at a quiet bakery 2 blocks from Alastair Sterling's office. Neither of them asked me to justify the binder I carried in my satchel, nor did they try to fill the silence with empty reassurances. Hannah simply bought 3 black coffees, and Miranda adjusted the collar of my dark trench coat, her fingers lingering for a second on my shoulder in a silent gesture of solidarity. At exactly 8:15, we stood in front of the mirror in the bakery's small restroom. I looked at my face in the harsh, yellow light. For years, I had been trained to look for my mother's shadow in the curve of my cheekbones and the set of my eyes. Today, I looked past her. I saw the quiet, stubborn chin of Grandfather Charles Langston. I saw the wide, observant eyes of Uncle Arthur. I was not a copy of my mother, I was the survival of the people she had spent decades trying to silence. We walked the 2 blocks to Alastair's office. The historic brick row house was cool inside, smelling of beeswax polish and old paper. Alastair's conference room was situated at the back of the building, its tall sash windows overlooking a small, high-walled courtyard filled with damp ferns and a single, ancient camellia bush. A long, oval mahogany table occupied the center of the room, polished to a dark, mirror-like sheen. Alastair sat at the head of the table, his blue estate folder open before him. I sat at his right, with Hannah and Miranda taking the chairs beside me. We did not speak. We waited in the heavy, expectant silence of a room that was about to witness a reckoning. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy oak door opened. Rupert Vance entered first. He was a tall, sharply dressed man with silvering temples and the brisk, unblinking confidence of a corporate attorney who spent his life defending a wealthy empire. He carried a sleek leather portfolio under his arm. Behind him came my father, Preston, wearing a gray wool suit that seemed slightly too large for his stooped shoulders. Then came my mother, Deborah. She was dressed in a tailored navy linen blazer, her silver-streaked hair styled into her signature, immaculate bob. On her left lapel sat a small, gold ginkgo leaf pin, the symbol of the Hawthorne Wellness Foundation. Her face was set into the very smile I had seen her wear at 1,000 charity luncheons, board meetings, and church fundraisers. It was a smile of supreme patience, of a benevolent matriarch who had come to offer a difficult child one final, undeserved chance at redemption. Silas entered last. He wore a wrinkled polo shirt and kept his eyes fixed firmly on the polished floorboards, refusing to look in my direction. Deborah did not look at Alastair. She did not look at Miranda or Hannah. She kept her eyes locked on my face, her smile widening by a fraction of an inch as she took her seat directly across from me. "Lydia, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying that soft, melodic cadence she used when addressing the local press. "I want you to know we are here in good faith. We don't want to escalate this unfortunate misunderstanding. We simply want what belongs to the family legacy, so we can all move forward in peace." I did not answer her. I reached into my satchel, pulled out the heavy black binder, and placed it flat on the mahogany table between us. The metal rings inside clicked against the wood with a sharp, heavy sound that seemed to echo in the quiet room. My mother's eyes flicked down to the binder for a brief second, her smile remaining perfectly in place. She had spent 30 years perfecting that mask, it was not going to slip for a plastic folder. Before Rupert Vance could open his portfolio, Alastair Sterling raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Rupert," Alastair said, his deep voice calm and entirely devoid of theatricality. "Before you begin your presentation, I am going to share 3 documents your clients have apparently failed to disclose to you. Once you have reviewed them, you may decide whether you wish to proceed with your demand. Personally, I believe you will choose to withdraw it immediately." Alastair slid a thin stack of photocopies across the polished wood. He did not send them to my parents, he sent them directly to Vance. Rupert, Alastair continued, your clients paid you to draft a cease and desist letter based on the claim that Lydia Hawthorne unlawfully converted proprietary family assets. I think your clients deserve to hear the actual legal standing of those assets from your own voice. Please turn to page 2, paragraph 3 of the document in front of you, and read it aloud. Rupert Vance adjusted his reading glasses, his brow furrowing as he looked at the blue notary seal on the page. He glanced at my father, but Preston was staring intently at his own folded hands. Vance's silver signet ring stopped its rhythmic tapping against his leather portfolio. The silence in the room became absolute, the kind of stillness that settles over a marsh just before a summer storm breaks. Vance cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice had lost its corporate edge, returning to the flat, neutral tone of a professional reading an indisputable record. I, Arthur Charles Langston, Vance read, being of sound mind and full testamentary capacity, hereby amend my last will and testament dated June 27, 2018, as follows. I bequeath to my niece, Lydia Hawthorne, of Atlanta, Georgia, the following items, all personal correspondence, botanical research journals, and historical apothecary records currently in my possession, including the original hand-formulated recipes of grandfather Charles Langston. I further bequeath to her a designated cash trust in the amount of $89,000, to be held by my attorney, Alastair Sterling, until claimed by Lydia Hawthorne in person. Vance paused, his eyes scanning the next paragraph. He looked up at my mother, his expression hardening, before returning to the page. I further direct, Vance continued, his voice dropping slightly, that no portion of my estate, intellectual property, or research papers, named or unnamed, may pass to Deborah Hawthorne or to Preston Hawthorne under any condition, including but not limited to the predecease of the named beneficiary. I watched my mother's face. The pristine, benevolent smile did not vanish all at once. It dissolved slowly, like ice melting under a hot lamp. First, the corners of her mouth began to twitch, the muscles that had held the expression in place for decades suddenly losing their tension. Her lips thinned, pressing together into a hard, pale line as she realized the words being read into the record were entirely real, entirely legal, and entirely devastating to her corporate claim. By the time Vance finished reading the final paragraph, her chin began to tremble. It was a tiny, involuntary movement, but in the quiet of the room, it was as loud as a scream. Her right hand drifted up to her collarbone, her manicured fingers clutching the gold ginkgo leaf pin on her lapel as if it could somehow protect her from the weight of her brother's voice. We challenge this, she said, her voice thin and sharp, stripped of all its melodic sweetness. Arthur was not in his right mind when he signed that paper. He was heavily medicated. He was confused. Alastair Sterling did not look surprised. He reached into his blue folder and slid 3 more sheets of paper across the table toward Vance. You challenged the codicil on those exact grounds in the probate court of Chatham County in October of 2020, Mrs. Hawthorne, Alastair said softly. You also challenged it on the grounds of undue influence in 2021, and on a procedural defect in 2023. You lost all 3 times. Those are the certified court dismissals. Your attorney, Rupert, was sent copies of these files yesterday morning. I assume he has already verified their authenticity. Rupert Vance did not look at my mother. He took off his reading glasses, placed them on top of his portfolio, and let out a long, slow breath. They are authentic, Deborah, Vance said, his voice entirely flat. The court orders are final. You do not own the journals. You never did. I opened the black binder to the 3rd tab and connected my phone to the small Bluetooth speaker Alastair had placed on the credenza. There is one more document, Alastair said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. Or rather, a record. Mrs. Hawthorne, this is an audio statement recorded by Hospice nurse Peter Wyatt at Arthur's explicit request on May 20, 2020. It was verified by a third-party notary. We will play only the relevant 90 seconds. He pressed a button on his tablet. My uncle's voice filled the room. It was thin, slow, and carrying the dry, raspy rattle of his final weeks, but every single word was articulated with absolute, crystalline clarity. My name is Arthur Langston, the recording began. Today is May 20th, 2020. I am of sound mind. I am making this recording because I know, with absolute certainty, that my sister, Deborah Hawthorne, will attempt to claim my niece was confused, or that she took advantage of me in my illness. Deborah has a history of this. She did it with our father's estate in 1998, rewriting his final wishes to suit her corporate ambitions. She did it then, and she will try to do it now. I want this recording to exist so that any court, any board, and any honest person can hear my actual voice state this: Lydia Hawthorne has my full consent, my full love, and the sole legal right to my research, my journals, and my estate. Do not let my sister steal the truth again. The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was suffocating. My father, Preston, slowly turned his head to look at his wife. His face was pale, his eyes hollowed out by a sudden, terrible realization. Deborah, he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the question. Did you do that to Charles in '98, too? You told me the court made a mistake. She did not answer him. She kept her eyes fixed on her manicured hands, her fingers still desperately clutching the gold ginkgo leaf pin on her blazer. Silas slowly took his elbows off the table, sank back into his chair, and covered his face with both hands. I have one more thing, I said, my voice quiet and steady. I wasn't going to bring it. But you sent a lawyer to my door, Mom. You asked for this meeting. So, let us finish it. I opened the binder to the 5th tab. I selected the audio file dated December 24, 2019, a voicemail my mother had left on my phone on Christmas Eve, thinking she had dialed my father's number. I let the room hear her voice, stripped of its public warmth, sharp and trembling with a bitter, ancient resentment. I can't even look at her, Preston, her voice echoed from the speaker. She has my father's face. The face of the man who never believed in me, who always looked at me like I was a disappointment. Every time Lydia walks into a room, I feel like Charles is back to judge me. I'm so tired. I'm so tired of looking at my own father through my own daughter. I just want her to leave us alone. I closed the laptop. The audio cut out, leaving only the sound of the wind rattling the sash windows of the old row house. My mother looked as though she had aged 10 years in the span of a single minute. The carefully constructed facade of the elegant, benevolent wellness matriarch had completely dissolved, leaving only a tired, bitter woman staring at her own reflection in the polished mahogany. I reached into my satchel, pulled out the thick envelope sealed with the red wax, and placed it in the exact center of the table. The words for Deborah, only if she asks why, faced her. I'm not going to make you open this in front of us, I said quietly. That is your brother's final gift to you, not mine. Take it home. Read it alone. Or don't. We are finished here. It took my mother 11 seconds to lift her face. During those 11 seconds, no one in the room looked at her. Rupert Vance stared at the ceiling. My father stared at his folded hands. Silas kept his face buried. When she finally looked at me, her mouth made a small, flat shape. The sound that came out was barely a whisper, flat and exhausted. Why? She asked. I did not open the envelope. I simply pushed it an inch closer to her side of the table. That is between you and Arthur now, I said. Rupert Vance stood up slowly. He did not look at my mother or my father. He folded his leather portfolio, closed his fountain pen with a sharp click, and looked directly at Alastair. Alastair, Vance said, his voice professional and entirely cold. My firm is withdrawing as corporate counsel for the Hawthorne Wellness Foundation effective immediately. My clients will receive a final invoice for services rendered to date. I will not be representing them in any further matters regarding this estate or any associated claims. Good day. He walked out of the room, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. At 12:30, my mother stood up. She picked up the sealed red wax envelope with trembling fingers and placed it in her handbag. My father folded his linen napkin into precise quarters, placing it on the table in the exact same gesture he had used on Tybee Island 6 months earlier. He did not look at me as he left. Silas did not stand. He waited until our parents' footsteps had faded down the hallway before he finally looked up at me, his eyes red and wet. "Can I call you sometime, Lydia?" he asked quietly. "Not yet," I replied. "Maybe someday. We'll see." Alastair waited until the building was entirely quiet before he turned to me, a soft, proud smile on his face. "Lydia," he said gently. "You did that the right way. Arthur would have been incredibly proud." Hannah and Miranda did not say a word. Hannah simply put her arm around my shoulders, and we walked out into the warm, humid Savannah afternoon. The fallout was swift, quiet, and devastating. The Hawthorne Foundation's annual charity gala and retirement dinner was scheduled for that upcoming Friday evening at a historic coastal pavilion. It was meant to be the crowning achievement of my father's career and the ultimate showcase for my mother's social dominance. But Alastair had already delivered the certified court records, the transcripts of Pete Wyatt's statement, and the proof of the intercepted estate notices to the Foundation's board of directors. The board, terrified of a public scandal that would destroy the luxury retail brand, quietly demanded my father's immediate, unceremonious retirement. At the gala that Friday, there were no grand speeches, no tribute videos, and no celebratory toasts. The atmosphere was freezing. Preston Hawthorne's retirement was announced in a brief, 3-sentence statement read by a junior board member. My mother did not attend. The local community, highly attuned to the subtle shifts in coastal high society, immediately began to do the math. The next morning, the Foundation's public portal carried a brief update: Preston and Deborah Hawthorne are stepping back from all public roles to focus on family health matters. We appreciate your respect for their privacy. By Monday, the comments section on the announcement was permanently disabled. By midweek, the post had been quietly deleted. My brother Silas moved out of our parents' Tybee Island home the following Thursday. He signed a lease on a tiny, Spartan studio apartment above an auto repair shop in Savannah, using his own savings to pay the deposit. He had been planning the move in secret for weeks. He did not call me, but he sent a physical letter, written in blue ink on lined notebook paper, delivered to my Atlanta apartment by cousin Brandon. I was the favorite because she could mold me into whatever she wanted, Silas wrote, his handwriting messy and hurried. I didn't understand what it was costing you, Lydia. I was blind, and I was selfish. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I finally see the truth. I am so sorry. I placed his letter in the bottom drawer of my dresser, right next to the empty space where the cedar box had once sat. The $89,000 from Uncle Arthur's trust cleared into my account that Friday. I did not keep a single penny of it. I sat with Alastair in his office, and together we established a permanent endowment at the Savannah Botanical Garden, the historic archive where Arthur had spent so many of his quiet hours. We named it the Arthur Langston Public Archive of Coastal Apothecary History. The funds were used to digitize his entire collection of research, making his original, hand-formulated organic recipes free and accessible to the public forever. The commercial monopoly my parents had spent decades trying to build on the backs of his labor was completely dismantled in a single afternoon. The truth was no longer a family secret, it belonged to the world. On Saturday morning, I drove to Tybee Island one last time. I did not stop at my parents' house. I took the winding back roads past the salt marshes to the quiet, moss-draped cemetery near the water. My uncle is buried beside grandfather Charles Langston. I sat on the weathered stone bench beneath a massive live oak, the warm coastal breeze rustling the leaves above. I carried the cedar box, the 17 letters, and the worn leather-bound volume of essays Arthur had given me when I was 16. I spent 2 hours reading his letters aloud to the quiet marsh, letting his words drift out over the water. When I reached the 17th letter, dated just 11 days before his death, my voice was steady and clear. "Lydia, you are reading this, which means I did what I needed to do," he had written. "Do not carry my grief back into your life. Remember that I left you light, not weight. Go live your life in the sun." I folded the final letter, placed it back inside the cedar box, and closed the lid. I did not leave the box on his grave. I placed it gently on the wooden bench beneath the live oak, leaving a small, handwritten note taped to the top: "To whoever finds this, these letters belong to a man who loved the truth. Read them, and pass them on." On my way out of the cemetery, I stopped at the small nursery near the gates. I bought a young, white-flowering camellia bush, the same variety Grandfather Charles had planted in his original garden, and planted it carefully in the dark earth beside Arthur's headstone. I drove back to Atlanta that evening, the radio playing a quiet, familiar melody as the sun dipped below the pine trees. When I got back to my apartment, I opened a brand new notebook with a plain, dark cover. On the very first page, in clean black ink, I wrote, "My name is Lydia Hawthorne. I am 32 years old. I am a doctor of pharmacy, a runner, and a friend. I am not the difficult one. I am simply the one who survived." Lessons from this story. Truth and integrity will eventually expose and dismantle systemic family deception. Genetic relation does not obligate someone to endure emotional abuse or manipulation. Meticulous documentation is a powerful defense against false accusations and legal threats. Reclaiming one's identity requires breaking free from toxic narratives imposed by others.